Hello, I'm Nate, aka Beachy Mutineer. I love RPGs and games with strong narratives, and I generally make guides and discuss such games here. Today, I want to share with you a very intriguing upcoming indie RPG that I think more people should know about, Rue Valley. It's a narrative RPG about a man trapped in a 47-minute time loop, and in terms of style, it's quite reminiscent of Disco Elysium, though I think it has its own mysterious vibe going on that is very much distinct from Disco Elysium. I played the playtest demo as part of the Southern Europe Game Festival on Steam that's running between November 12th and 20. It's a very early alpha version of the game and just a little part of it from the beginning, meaning that they still have some placeholder assets and not everything is fully implemented. Even so, I was extremely impressed with the game. The story was incredibly compelling. I loved the protagonist's animations, and in general, the visual style is on point. The writing is very well done. The voice acting is pretty good, although I'd say the protagonist's voice isn't exactly what I expected, though they may improve that in the future. I'll talk about the good and the bad a little bit later, but know that even with some slight issues, I would still buy this game on release day and immediately play it for like 6 hours straight. I knew about the game for a while now because it's being published by Owlcat Games, the devs behind the Pathfinder games and Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. Owlcat has in the meantime also branched out to publish games in addition to developing them, and I'm actually really glad they gave this game a larger following by choosing to publish it. The developers themselves are called Emotion Spark Studio, with their office in Cyprus and their development studio in Serbia. They don't seem to have made any games before Rue Valley, though I assume this is because it's a new studio. Based on the amazing concept as well as the high quality I already saw in the playtest demo, it's very clear to me that the devs working on this game are very skilled and passionate. I've seen a good chunk of disappointing or otherwise underwhelming AAA games in the past few years, so frankly I'm all about supporting smaller studios and looking towards indie and AA games to fill the gap left behind by these AAA fumbles, especially in the RPG genre. These smaller projects have much more heart than the games developed for the profits of huge corporations, and so they also tend to go more experimental with their ideas because they're trying to make something more unique, even if it means it's more niche. The concept or narrative setup for Rue Valley is very dear to me because I've always loved stories about time loops as well as alternate realities or universes. There's something so compelling about being able to see many different what-ifs play out, to focus on different parts of the plot or mystery, different characters, and see how the story transforms based on the characters' choices and new information. This is why I'm finding Rue Valley so compelling. It's just a type of story I've always loved. So do keep this in mind as I talk about the game. I obviously have a bias towards the story concept, and while I think anyone who loves story-rich RPGs in the vein of Disco Elysium should at least give the demo a try, it's up to you to decide whether you vibe with this game or not. With this context explained, let's get into discussing the game's most important elements. The story, as I've said, is based on this idea of a time loop. The protagonist, Eugene Harrow, seems to be stuck in a 47-minute time loop between 8 p.m. and 8:47 p.m., during which, at the very end, the sky ominously lights on fire. Is this the end of the world? Is it some kind of manifestation of the protagonist's psyche as he's hallucinating everything that's happening in this supposed time loop? I have no idea, and I want to find out. All we know from this little demo is that Mr. Harrow has been ordered to have some kind of treatment that seems to be mandated therapy. However, the weird part is that this therapy is supposed to take place in a very isolated area in the middle of the desert. Suspicious much? Furthermore, during this time loop, Harrow receives a phone call from someone claiming to be part of Ulterior Paralegal Exploits Consultancy, a firm which supposedly wants to help Harrow with his case regarding him having been unjustly forced to participate in treatment which, quote, may have consequences not aligned with your best interests, end quote. Is this a real person on the line, or is it some part of the protagonist's psyche? I'm getting some really weird psychological sci-fi or even sci-fantasy kind of vibes. Very cool. There's a lot more to analyze as part of just the tiny details we get during this demo story. I could spend all day breaking everything down and speculating on the mystery, and that's how you know the story is good. Even just from a single 45-minute playthrough of the demo, I'm completely hooked. The characters are intriguing from what I've seen so far, which is ultimately not a lot. Just the protagonist, the therapist, a person kicking and screaming at a vending machine, a receptionist, and a possibly drunk driver. While the secondary characters are interesting for sure, and I'm looking forward to finding out more about them during the full game, I think I'm most interested in the protagonist, Harrow. Part of why I like him so much is his name, because even though this is his last name, he shares it with one of my favorite characters, Harrow from the Locked Tomb sci-fantasy book series by Tamsin Muir. That character also has mental issues, so it's kind of fun to see two characters referred to as Harrow who both seem to be grappling with mental instability. And especially based on what will happen as part of the story of Rue Valley, it's even possible they both struggle with hallucinations. I certainly get an eerie feeling from the events and visuals of Rue Valley so far, which does make me consider the possibility that Harrow is perhaps stuck inside his own head by some experimental therapy, and this is all a dream or hallucination. Though it's also entirely possible that there is a supernatural element, the world is ending, and Harrow is the one who can stop it, as he is stuck in this time loop. I really can't speculate much more than this about Harrow, who he is, what his background is, and what his role is in the story, but I can't wait to find out. The setting is very colorful and feels to me like it fits that aesthetic of seedy motel in the desert, though obviously I have no idea if that's accurate since I'm European. But there's a very strong undercurrent of weird permeating everything, and in particular it combines really well with the way your character can behave differently based on his initial stats as well as the various status effects inflicted upon him by his own choices. Speaking of stats and status effects, I'll briefly talk about character customization and status effects that impact your personality and thus the choices you have available to you during a loop. In character creation, you get to assign 9 points on 3 scales of personality: impulsive to calculated, introverted to extroverted, and sensitive to indifferent. There are various types of traits you can get as you put more points towards one of the ends of each spectrum, such as the flat or unkind traits if you're towards the indifferent end, or the guilt-ridden or dramatic traits if you're towards the sensitive end. If you're in the middle, you can even choose which of these 2 traits you want active. I like this idea of assigning personality points, but I have to say that it feels extremely limiting to be forced to assign all 9 points. Because of this, I wasn't really able to create the personality I wanted because I was forced to make my character feel a bit too extreme in one direction, at least in terms of how these points on the scale are described. I was trying to create a character inspired by my own personality, so I felt like putting 2 points towards a particular end, but that meant I had to invest 4 or more points in one of the other scales to be able to continue. Obviously, I understand that Harrow is supposed to be mentally unstable, or unwell at least, but at the same time, I'm given the option to customize his personality, so I wish I had a little more freedom there. Frankly, I'd even be interested in trying to play a perfect balance kind of character, where you don't spend any points, but instead of making the perfect character, you create an absolute control freak who is attempting to behave in the correct ways in order to keep whatever mental issues he has at bay. It would be very interesting to see just how many dialogue options you could have locked off due to this controlling nature of Harrow, seeing all the various impulses he ignores or shuts down in order to keep himself acting normal, and having this normal behavior be seen as very strange and obviously artificial by the other characters. Based on various choices or perhaps moments you reach in the story, you can also get various status effects that are applied onto your character and which affect your choices in interactions and dialogue. They also seem to sometimes affect your personality points, which also have an effect on what you can choose in your various interactions. You can get a wet sock status effect, which can allow you to unpack your suitcase to look for a dry sock, even if otherwise you may not have had the motivation to be able to unpack the suitcase. I really love these status effects, and I love the fact that they really mainly seem to come from your own choices, other than the starting status effect you start with called a complete lack of motivation, which mood. Loved the wet sock in particular because I also hate the feeling of a wet sock enough to add it as a negative status effect into a game. In terms of gameplay, I appreciated the exploration even if it was fairly limited in the demo, although it's possible I missed something in my playthrough. I love that based on your personality as well as the status effects, certain choices are available or locked, since that obviously adds a lot of different interactions you can have over the course of a playthrough as you go through the time loop over and over, but also possibly over multiple playthroughs if there are certain things you maybe can't change during the game, such as the traits you choose when you create your personality. I'm not entirely sure how skill checks work because you don't really have skills or numbers for them, and the skill checks per se also don't show you any dice rolling or any numbers happening. I don't know how to feel about that. On one hand, it kind of fits the game to not know how a skill check will go at all until you see either red or green. On the other hand, it feels a bit too random to not have any clue on how that skill check might go in terms of how your character feels about his chances to succeed at such an interaction. I don't particularly appreciate randomness in something that is heavily story and choice-based, but at the same time, I feel like the mysterious nature of the story setup with the time loop may make this randomness feel okay. With such a short demo and only a few such skill checks, I really can't tell, so we'll find out how I feel about this during a later demo or when the game comes out. Either way, it's not really a deal breaker for me. Disco Elysium has too much randomness in my opinion with the critical failures and successes, but it's still one of my all-time favorite games, so as long as the story is good, I don't care so much about these little details. I think the visuals are amazing. I always love these stylized graphics way more than something trying to be photorealistic. Of course, that is as long as the style actually fits the tone of the game, which in this case, it absolutely does. The animations are very satisfying, especially for the protagonist. I didn't get to see much from the other characters, so I'm hoping that they will be given a bit more love as well in terms of animations, especially since I imagine the game takes place in a small area, likely this motel and a nearby town or something, so the characters that are there are likely all at least somewhat important to the mystery. The fonts and UI are overall good, though I do have some frustrations with them. The gray boxes that I believe are showing your dialogue made the text unreadable, so I would love to see them change to a white box or off-white to increase readability. The size of the text and the UI also felt a bit too small, so I would appreciate either having the font size increase slightly overall, or to have an option in the menu to increase the size of the text because I did struggle to read it at times. The constellation of thoughts thing also looks very cool, though it is just a little bit confusing as to what to do once you've clicked on the last available thought in the group. I believe you're supposed to click off of it somewhere in order to trigger the conclusion, but you may not know how to do this because there's no prompt to do so. I would add a prompt where the conclusion is supposed to appear that says conclude or something like that, and have the player click on that in order to proceed, just so that it's clear and so it also feels more like an active choice a player makes, even if it's the only choice. The audio was very clearly not quite there yet in terms of sound mixing. The music was too loud, there weren't any sound settings in the menu to allow you to turn down the music or to turn up the voices or stuff like that. Obviously I know this is a very early build, but I think it's a good idea to include these options whenever you release any kind of demo for players, even if it's an early alpha playtest. Sound is a very important aspect that makes a game feel more immersive and satisfying to play, or if it's bad, it can really decrease your enjoyment of the game. The voice acting was overall good, loved the secondary characters, but I didn't really like the protagonist's voice. I guess he just didn't sound like I expected him to, and his voice wasn't particularly compelling. Maybe this is something that will be changed later on. It's entirely possible a lot of these voice lines are placeholders, just to get a general sense of what the game will be like. In conclusion, as you can tell from my thoughts, it's clear Rue Valley is in an early phase of its development, and it obviously has some kinks to iron out. However, even with all of these issues, I see so much potential, and not just potential. This game is already incredibly fun to play, even in this rough state. I hope that if the devs see my video, there is something useful in my feedback here, and that they feel incredibly proud already of what they've made so far, because they've made an RPG that feels really special. I personally will definitely buy Rue Valley day one, and make a comprehensive review of it once I've done at least a full playthrough whenever the game releases. If you've played the demo for yourself, or have thoughts based on what I've shown you, do leave a comment below with your opinions. I'm very curious to read them. As always, if you look forward to more videos about RPGs and other games I like, do remember to subscribe and leave a like and comment while you're at it too. They really help. A special thank you to my members who help keep this channel running. I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider joining the channel as a member to support me and unlock perks like early access to videos. This has been B-Tier Mutineer. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.